The site of the first known incident did not display any of the damage that was described in the reports. What remained of the burnt-out ruin had been torn down, cleaned up, and carted away. A new flour mill sat blithely upon the foundations of its predecessor, the fresh daub of its walls gleaming in the noonday sun. Imagining someone just walking up and lighting this place on fire feels surreal. Looking up at the mill beside Ludmilla, Andrei offered a grunt in agreement. Built at the top of a hill, the building had a commanding view of the surrounding countryside. Anyone casually walking up to it would be seen quite plainly. No one in their right mind would simply stroll up and set it aflame, expecting to get away with it. With the bulk of the harvest already processed, the mill had very little traffic. Still, the local authorities saw fit to station a death knight at the entrance. I wonder if a death knight would even be effective in this situation. Beg your pardon, Camilla? The death knights won't preemptively attack the citizens, Ludmilla explained. A charmed individual could walk up in broad daylight without challenge. Half of the interior would already be on fire by the time the sentry noticed the smoke. Andrei frowned at her observation. Rebuilding the mill served two purposes. The first was because the citizens in the surrounding villages needed it. The second was to show that the local administrators would not give in to whatever the perpetrator's motive was. A sentry had been placed just in case any retaliation was directed towards the new building. It never came to pass, however. Instead, a mill was destroyed on the opposite side of the county a week later. Another mill went up in flames a week after that. House Volkenheim continued chasing the weekly incidents around, except the fourth week ended with 3 more arsons. With a strong recommendation from the county's elder liches to call someone in, the count had finally relented. Except the person they called in had no idea how she was supposed to help. While the Sorceress Kingdom's administration might see her as a human and assume that all humans acted the same way, this thinking only held on a fundamental level. The problems that frontier populations faced were far removed from the issues of the interior, and they may as well have been two lands separated by vast distances rather than two territories of the same nation right next to one another. The magnitude and nature of crime were different. In the past, one could not set a mill on fire in Warden's Vale, since there was no mill in the first place. Most labor was done by hand with personal tools. Everyone knew everyone, and destroying something everyone relied on made trouble for everyone one knew, which included friends and loved ones. If the damage was severe enough, the settlement's very existence would be put into jeopardy. Violence amounted to brawls, and brawls were welcome in Warden's Vale. Aggression was required to fight threats to the border, and honing that aggression was an ongoing thing. Bystanders knew when to break up fights if they got out of hand and sent the battered combatants to Bohodin. In the interior, there were just so many people, and one would encounter more strangers than acquaintances. That one was a single person amongst a vast sea of people changed how one perceived their actions. Damaging a community was not an existential threat to the entire population. There was always somewhere to run, some place where no one knew who one was. She supposed that her exposure to this behavior was a good thing. Warden's Vale was no longer a tiny community, and it was possible that these types of crimes would come hand in hand with its growing population. Recalling the group of immigrants that had appeared uninvited in Warden's Vale from Croston, she wondered if their blatant disregard for the law was common. Out of the settlements in your territories, Ludmilla asked, did any have a history of incidents like this? That's hard to say, Andrei replied. House Volkenheim took over land that half of the nobles abandoned. They weren't nice enough to leave a neat pile of helpful notes for whoever they thought would rule here next. Even when it comes to the fiefs with intact administrations, I can't say that the record-keeping was very good. Things have gotten better with the arrival of the elder liches, of course, but that won't give you any of the answers you're looking for. And the only territories unaffected are those under House Volkenheim's direct management. Which is a blatant attempt at misdirection. We've worked hard to get this place up to the administration's standards, and a whole lot of feathers were probably ruffled along the way. It's clear that they have a problem with us in particular. Jez next door hasn't had a single issue. Ludmilla appreciated that Andrei was more open with her now, but she didn't like how he attempted to preempt her thoughts. He was still very defensive when it came to House Volkenheim. They at least have some sense of what to attack, Ludmilla said. Instead of lighting fields and forests ablaze, they're targeting production bottlenecks. After the summer harvest ended, they switched from flour mills to lumber mills. If you noticed that, Andre said, why did you start here? Because it was on the way to the most recent site? Ludmilla replied, it didn't hurt to look. Do all of the mills have wooden frames like this? The design differs depending on what's used to run them, but yes, they all use timber frames. It's the material we have the most of on hand, after all. Wood louse. What's taking so long? Ludmilla raised a hand to her ear. You've completed your sweep? I have. These local maps are garbage. The ranger that made these may as well have been a caterpillar. What about the most recent ones from the administration? They are accurate. Thank you. We're headed to the site of the most recent arson now. We'll meet you there. Hold on to those caterpillar maps. The message spell abruptly cut off, and Ludmilla lowered her hand with a bemused smile. People usually don't smile after speaking to Miss Nobby. Andre looked at her thoughtfully. I appreciate her efficiency, Ludmilla replied. She has her own sort of charm, as well. We should get moving. Miss Nobby is on her way to our destination already. They hopped back into the awaiting carriage, which felt insufferably slow, and headed northeast towards a small forest under the management of one of Count Volkenheim's baronial vassals. It was nondescript enough to be something used by members of the noble households traveling back and forth from the territories de Crosten, so Ludmilla conceded that it was a useful way to hide their movements on the open rural roads. Since she died in the Azalazia Mountains, Ludmilla's capabilities as a ranger had diminished somewhat, so she wasn't confident in her ability to conceal her presence in the farmlands. As Ludmilla watched the fields and hamlets roll by, a detail she had first noted in Crosten started to bother her. Volkenheim County does not seem to have much in the way of undead, she noted. The Death Knight at the mill is the only one we have come across so far out here. Adoption of undead labor has been slow, Andre told her. Lord Volkenheim and his court have seen the projections from the administration, but juggling 40,000 people around isn't something that can be done in a season. Has anything particularly problematic occurred? Aside from these arsons, that is. Andre leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms and rubbing a chin with one hand. The temple's been pretty sour about the whole thing, he said, but there's nothing they can do about it. They haven't spoken out against the Sorcerer King or the undead? The ranger snorted. Course not. That would be tantamount to suicide. They can't do anything but stick to their shrines and temples and keep working quietly. You're not suggesting that they're the ones to blame for this, are you? No, I was just wondering if there was any resistance to the use of undead on the religious front. There isn't any active effort by the temple to resist the adoption of the undead, Andre said, but how we see the undead has been ingrained in us since childhood. The enemy of the living, as they say. Until the Sorcerer King showed up, nothing gave us any reason to doubt. They call those wild undead now, don't they? Ludmilla nodded quietly, idly adjusting the ring on her right hand. She wasn't sure if she was wild undead or not. Have you had any success at all with undead labor? She asked after several minutes. A few of the braver families were willing to give it a try, Andre said. There was a lot of confusion at first, but I think they got the hang of it. The crops did the same as everyone else's, so it was at least proven to work. My lord hopes that it will encourage others to try, but... But? Ludmilla prompted him. Well, there are two main problems, Andre told her. The first is that, like I just said, the crops did the same as everyone else. Why was that a problem? If anything, it showed how useful skeletal laborers were. Andre grinned at her confusion. If Sanju had a face, he said, it might look like yours does right now. Maybe, she glanced at the elder lich. What you said makes little sense to me. At least a part of it is our fault, Andre said. We gave them the recommended number of skeleton laborers for their land. Ah, I see. Yeah. The handful of households using undead labor got to kick up their feet all season, but what everyone else saw was the same yield as themselves. You probably know how it goes from there. She did. Tenancy was essentially a venture where the leaseholder was running a family business on the plot of land defined by the terms of their contract. A landlord was supposed to issue enough land to support a family under the lease stipulated in their agreement, meaning that every household roughly had the same amount of land as their neighbors. Since the results were borne by personal effort, successful tenants had an intrepid mentality with a high degree of pride and confidence in their ability to work their land. In short, They did not see any point in leasing skeleton labor when they could do it themselves for the same result. Lord Vulcanheim has taken steps to make the difference clear, I assume? There should be plenty of abandoned plots after the annexation. Too late for that, Andre replied. We were busy just getting things going again, so we just drew up contracts for all of the second and third sons out of those that stayed to assume tenancy. Winter will be the best time to try something, but it's going to be ugly. I can hear all of the angry farmers demanding why certain families get more land than others already. We've got one long headache ahead of us. They couldn't tell them that it was because those who received more land were willing to use undead labor since there wasn't enough land for all of the households that would suddenly volunteer to use undead labor. Forests couldn't be cleared because those forests were under management by other tenants and represented a significant share of the county's primary industries. By changing it, all derivative industries would be adversely affected. Adopting undead labor, consolidating land and encouraging people to abandon their ancestral vocations in a time of unprecedented plenty. Juggling was an understatement. Ludmilla could almost feel all the hungry eyes looking at her undeveloped lands and demanding that she be relinquished of the territories that weren't being properly utilized. I don't envy House Vulcanheim for the work it has ahead of it, she said in sympathetic tones. I had a vague sense that the more densely populated territories would have issues adjusting, but knowing some of the specific details makes it seem a nightmare. What about the undead security forces? They aren't tied to this problem. We've gone with the royal court's recommendations for the number of death knights required to maintain order in the county. That should be a fair number of them, Ludmilla said, but they appear to be quite scarce. I think I saw 2 hidden away at each gatehouse in Croston, but there are no patrols on the roads. The majority are deployed along the border, Andre replied. Ludmilla furrowed her brow. While maintaining internal security did mean that one was responsible for local borders, the network of roads connecting all of the hamlets and villages in a fief was a priority when it came to where a regular noble should project the administration's presence. Have there been issues with the neighboring territories? I understand that 3 of your borders are essentially wilderness. Overall, it's become safer, I think, Andre told her. Tob is a new border, but, according to Baroness Allard, the threat of attacks from the forest have always been next to non-existent. If anything, she gets more demi-humans poking their heads out now than ever before, but they're more like visits than raids. I've been curious about how the northern frontier has held up so well compared to the south, Ludmilla said. Are you saying that the tribes in the north have just kept to themselves all this time? I'm not sure how to put this exactly, but it was because of the local politics. Politics? Andre held up a hand with an apologetic look. Yeah, that probably isn't the right word, he said. It's more that there was a long stalemate between 3 powers in the forest, the Serpent of the West, the Giant of the East, and the Wise King of the Forest, who controlled the South. The Wise King of the Forest was a singular force that suppressed everything else in her territory, meaning that tribes, monsters and the predatory population in general never grew to the point that competition would turn their attention outwards. Cheating. The northern frontier lords were dirty cheaters. It was like having a dragon conveniently placed on a mountain nearby that took care of every threat while leaving their territories alone. You speak of this king in the past tense. What happened to her? About a year ago, she became Momon's pet. Eh? Do you mean that giant rodent with the long tail that always sleeps in front of Momon's guest manor? The one with the Death Knight? Ah, so you've seen her. Yes, that's the Wise King of the Forest. It was true that she was very powerful and very fluffy, but she also seemed very lazy. Then again, predators often seemed that way. She understood that the Sorceress Kingdom extended its control over the great forest of Tob long before the annexation of Erantal, so it made sense that no disturbances resulted from the shift in the balance of power. What about the other 2 powers? What happened to them? I have no idea, Andre shrugged. The people up here only know them by their names, but details on race or character, well, I guess I've always imagined them to be heteromorph or demi-human lords of some sort. After seeing the Wise King of the Forest, however, there being monsters is also a strong possibility. She made a mental note to ask after them. They could potentially provide some insight into the management of tribal populations. The frontier lords of the north, since their circumstances are a product of these politics, does it mean that they aren't militant nobles? The northern territories aren't anything remotely like a wild frontier, Andre replied. One might think they're border lords, But they're functionally regular nobles. Even our old territory saw more trouble. I see. Fixing her face into a neutral expression, Ludmilla turned her gaze to the scenery outside. The old Lady Allard and her daughters frequently made appearances at the noble functions in Erantal that Ludmilla had occasionally attended as a child. Lady Allard was the daughter of one of the noble houses in another part of Riestais, and her daughters were 2 and 3 years younger than Ludmilla, respectively. She had thought that, since their mother was from the Heartlands, she had influenced her daughters to behave more like herself, but it had turned out that they weren't from a militant house at all. A sense of loneliness and unease settled over her. Beyond being the last of her house, Ludmilla Zaradnik may have been the last of her kind. Nobbe was already at the site of the burned-out mill, arms crossed as she waited for them in the shade of a gnarled oak tree. The adventurer's dark eyes betrayed none of the impatience conveyed through her message spell as Ludmilla, Andrei and Sanju came up to join her. From what remained of it, Ludmilla saw that the lumber mill was of a type powered by physical labor, like many forested locations in the duchy that did not have access to large enough streams. Its charred frame had already been taken apart and dumped in a pile nearby. Building materials were being collected in the village not 200 meters away in the county administration's bid to display how indomitable their will was against the unknown troublemaker. Ludmilla walked around slowly as she read over the report, trying to create an image of the freshly destroyed facility in her mind. There were 2 other rangers present when you came here last? Yeah, Andrei replied. Local men that knew the place better than me. I was hoping they might notice something that I couldn't. We only got as far as every other incident. Do you want to see the girl? The girl? About 8 years old. I suppose that targeting a child would nearly eliminate the chance of resisting a charm spell. She looked over to Nobby, who inclined her head slightly in confirmation. Ludmilla frowned down at the report again. It says here that she was foraging for summer berries when she was charmed, but the 3 of you couldn't find any trace of the spellcaster in the area. Is it even possible for a low-level caster to elude 3 experienced rangers? Low level? Andrei struggled with a foreign term. Low difficulty rating, by adventurer reckoning. You should have been able to at least find some trace of this person after so many attacks. The victims must be within the range of the spell, and they must be visible in the caster's line of sight. That's what Sanju here said. Andrei jerked his head over at the Elder Lich. The part about what the spell needs to work, that is. For the last 3 incidents, I've tried figuring out where each charm victim might have been targeted from without leaving any sign of their passing. There are only so many places from where you can charm someone in their bed through the only window in their house. Even then, I couldn't find anything. Ludmilla considered the options that such a person might have. A stranger carefully studying a village and potential victims to cast charm person on would probably be noticed by the villagers. Being careful about it might have been plausible when it only happened once a week. The distance between incidents in the past week, however, made for a day's walk each. 2 days to travel, carefully observe the locals and commit the deed from a perfectly untraceable location felt like a stretch. Do you feel that anything has changed in the way things are being carried out this week? Ludmilla asked. Not really, Andrei answered. Every incident uses one of a handful of methods that we've seen in the last month. As long as it's untrackable, it doesn't seem to matter. She started flipping through the reports again. Even the motive of their mysterious suspect was not clear. They were all carefully conducted attacks on industrial bottlenecks that were processing high volumes of goods. All of the attacks were damaging the property of every noble but Count Vulkanheim, but the Count was allocating his resources to help with repairs. What would House Vulkanheim have done about this if it were still a part of Riestais? Gone broke, probably, Andrei grimaced. It might have been the Count's title, but we weren't anything like those high lords that fairy tales describe. I've heard of minor nobles being driven into a corner like this in the past. A criminal group putting pressure on an honest lord, someone keeping their rival from getting ahead, or even just a big noble keeping all the little ones around him down. Most nobles in Riestais were even more small and poor than we were. It doesn't take much to put a house like that in a really bad situation. Is it possible that this is what's happening here? Ludmilla asked. No. All the nobles here have an elder lich looking over their shoulder, and I don't think they do that sort of thing anyway. Riestais is scared spitless of the sorceress kingdom, so they wouldn't dare. When criminal groups do this, It's one of two things, coercion or retaliation. Retaliation? Yeah, Andre nodded. Say someone takes a moral stand or at least makes an effort to enforce the law. A group of criminals would act to show that they're not to be challenged. It doesn't matter to them that they'll ruin the lives of innocent people, it only matters that they have free reign over their turf to do whatever they're doing. Unless their target has the information and strength to strike at them directly, it's a battle that they'll inevitably lose. It doesn't seem very fair, but those that live a life of crime always seem to be stronger than their victims. When a group of platinum rank thugs shows up to break your legs or sell your family into slavery, all most people can do is pray. Against something like this, they're even more helpless. Every time Ludmilla heard something about the criminal elements of Ria's ties, the darker her image of the place became. How could one even fight against people that were willing to stoop so low? The vast majority of people, as Andre had pointed out, were not strong. This included members of the nobility. At even the slightest hint of resistance, a single thug with the power of a small army could walk up to a manor and kill an entire household and family before word even got out to the next nearest village. By the time any response arrived, it would be too late. The initiative appeared to lay entirely within the grasp of the aggressors, who could pick and choose likely targets at will. I take it that you know about this because of House Facet. There were a lot of stories like that, yeah. From our neighbors to the west, too. Most nobles know, but frontier lords probably wouldn't. Anyone like that shows up in your territory, you'd probably squish them in some unspeakable way as a warning to everyone else. They would just quietly disappear. Well, that's terrifying in its own way, Andre smirked. The more twisted a person is, the more twisted the things they can imagine. At any rate, coercion or retaliation. If it's retaliation, the targeted lord would know why and we don't have any clue. If it's coercion, there would be a demand. A demand hasn't arrived and anyone arriving with a demand would end up in Sanju's clutches. Ludmilla nodded in agreement. Criminals whose motives revolved around direct gains would gain no ground in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. I don't like the way this is going, she muttered. Have you figured out what's going on? Nobe suddenly developed an interest in the conversation. No, Ludmilla replied, but without a motive like the ones we went over, the problem has either become bigger or smaller. Either way, it expands the list of potential suspects greatly. Explain. She glanced over to Andrea and Sanju, hoping that they might have latched onto something, but they looked at her just as expectantly as Nobe. I don't think like an inland noble, Ludmilla said, so I hope you can understand how I express this. If the problem is bigger, then I can only envision it as a part of a greater strategy. There are two that I can think of offhand. The first is that someone is testing how vulnerable our supply lines are. The second is that there are indirect or relative gains to be made from these acts, that these are tactics employed to achieve broader strategic goals. Both can be from domestic or foreign sources, and not necessarily involving militant organizations. None of His Majesty's servitors would do such a thing, Sanju said. What if you were commanded to? Ludmilla asked. The elder lich offered no response. Nobe narrowed her eyes. Are you suggesting that we've been sent by His Majesty to solve a problem that His Majesty intentionally started, so we could be sent out to solve it? Whether she was angry or incredulous, Ludmilla could not tell. It would be nice if that was the case, Ludmilla replied. It would mean that the state of the Sorcerer's Kingdom is now stable enough that the administration is willing to start testing for weaknesses. Something like a combat exercise, though I've never heard of it being done with administrative and judicial systems. I'm not sure whether to be worried or relieved hearing that, Andre said. What we have to be worried about is everything else it might be, Ludmilla told him. Another nation might be feeling out our capabilities, or a local interest might be investigating whether there are opportunities for crime in the future. Someone might be suppressing production because it's slowly starting to affect prices for goods in the region. That it's only happening in Vulcanheim County might suggest that it's someone from the Sorcerer's Kingdom trying to tilt the economic scales between territories, or it could be a foreign agent trying to sow the seeds of discord. All right, Andre sighed, that just got too big for me. What if the problem became smaller? It goes from some unfathomable grand strategy to something manageable by local authorities, Ludmilla replied. Yet it still means that you will have to expect that behavior from now on. Countermeasures will have to be developed for when these incidents start again. Andre frowned at the last, eyes turning sharp. Start again? You mean we're never going to be able to stop this? This particular string of cases will end eventually, Ludmilla said. But what is happening here represents the administration's inability to deal with a particular problem. A weakness. If you don't address a weakness, your enemies will keep attacking it. Sooner or later, everyone will know about that weakness and you will be at their mercy. But once we catch this guy, we'll know what his trick is and why he's doing it. Knowing what methods are being used don't always end with a working solution, she told him. One may learn how a monster or a demi-human behaves, but it will not save them if the gap in strength is too great. All one can do is struggle until they die, knowing how they'll die every moment of that struggle. We're not dealing with a monster or demi-human, I hope. It was still a possibility, but Ludmilla couldn't imagine why a monster or one of the local demi-humans would attack in such a broad, yet specific way. I have no idea yet, she said, but the basic situation is the same. I know of no way to stop a random person from charming another person at a random time in a random location to attack a random target in a place as large as Valkyrie County. All we can do is try and figure out who did it and dispense the appropriate justice. The motive, in the end, may also be seemingly random. People have rational and irrational sides, and sometimes that irrational side is unavoidable. Okay, we went from monsters and demi-humans to crazy people. How many crimes result from unrestrained emotion, irrational thinking or plain madness? Do you believe that our current measures in any way prevent crimes of passion or those committed by people who have lost their grasp on reason and sense? Whose perception of the world has warped to the degree that their reality has become irreconcilable to ours? A Death Knight should be able to stop such an act if they're there just at the right moment, but His Majesty's servitors can't be everywhere. Also, monsters and demi-humans probably have their different types of crazy, too. That's the last thing I needed to hear. Andre rolled his eyes. You speak as if we need an answer for every possible weakness because motives can be entirely irrational. Something like that, Ludmilla smiled slightly. Nobles in all situations have their own attacks to deal with, I suppose. As the world always changes, so too can the attacks that are directed against us. For as long as House Valkenheim holds their title, the defense of it will be their duty. The nondescript carriage returned to Crostonwell after nightfall. Andre dropped them off in front of the inn, and Sanju returned to the town hall. Ludmilla and Nobe returned to their room, heads drooped in defeat. Well, not Nobe. She had never seen the adventurer do anything remotely close to drooping. After shutting the door, Nobe sat down on her bed and resumed staring at Ludmilla. Shall we head down for a late dinner? Ludmilla asked. I'm fine. An hour passed as Ludmilla pored over her notes for the day. She stopped after reviewing her initial thoughts for the third time. Miss Nobby, as someone from a different land, did you find fault with anything that I said? Why do you ask? Insight from someone with different views can be helpful. Nobbe shifted on her bed, then drew her legs under her. For the first time in Ludmilla's recollection, the adventurer appeared to relax somewhat. Your thoughts were expressed in a way that was easy to understand for me, Nobbe told her, but I don't understand how you can tolerate any of this, or why. I'd think that someone so well-traveled as yourself would be possessed of a much wider range of tolerances than my own. Perhaps, Nobbe's tone lent the impression of a shrug, but living amongst these people has been especially vexing. It's as if you cannot decide what you are or where you stand. Ludmilla looked up from her notes, then chided herself for being self-conscious again. You might be right about that, she conceded, but at the same time, I haven't seen any advanced non-human societies. No, that's not true. There's the Sorceress Kingdom, particularly the servants who came with His Majesty. They are not any single race, and they vary widely in their nature, attitudes and personalities. As someone who has a growing number of different peoples in my territory, I occasionally wonder how the Sorcerer King plans to achieve harmony. Nobbe's lips opened slightly, then closed again. Though she had met her months ago, Ludmilla still did not know much about the being that lurked behind the human guise of Nobbe. Was she an entirely different person? What did she truly think about the Sorceress Kingdom? Moman had stayed to stand in opposition to the Sorcerer King on behalf of the people, but in recent times he was reportedly developing a rapport with the undead sovereign. The beautiful princesses was a different story, however. Nobbe followed silently in their wake, and she betrayed nothing of her thoughts on the matter. She still might harbor the same notions as Momon when the Dark Warrior first stood for the people, or her loyalties might only belong to Momon. "Forgive me if it seems like prying," Ludmilla said, "but is there a reason why you act in such a reserved fashion all the time? I thought you might be more sociable in private, but it doesn't seem to be the case." "Reserved? I'm sorry," Ludmilla quickly put in, "I was considering it in human terms. Maybe it's normal for your race." Nobe remained silent for a moment, a series of complicated expressions playing over her face. "It's just the way I am. Other members of my race are far better at blending in with strange people." The adventurer's eyes narrowed. "Did you just do something?" I wasn't aware of it if I did." Nobe snorted. She cast a derisive look in Ludmilla's direction. "For all of the superior qualities you hold relative to others of your kind, you still possess many of their fatal flaws. How can one not know what they're doing? Someone mocked me over something like that recently. And rightly so. I can only wonder how much time you wasted today with your investigation." "I did ask if you found fault with anything I said." "Nothing was wrong with what you said. Everything was wrong with what you did." Ludmilla could only offer an uncomprehending look in reply to Nobe's statement. The adventurer closed her eyes, releasing a sharp sigh. "I truly don't understand," Ludmilla said weakly. "So it seems. Do you believe that His Majesty would specifically send you here for something that any human with a modicum of intelligence could do? Why didn't you use any of your skills or abilities today?" "Ski what?" "Maybe you are forever doomed to fall to your own ignorance." Nobe looked away. "I believe you died several times for a similar reason." "You knew about that?" She wasn't sure why she asked. Darkness stood at the pinnacle of the Adventurer Guild, and it was Momon that made her aware of her deficiency. With how much time Momon spent studying the problem, Nobe said, "One can hardly forget. It is the foolishness of humans. Your rationality only exists at the same level as the teeming masses of your kind. Skills, abilities and magic are an undeniable part of reality, yet most of them somehow fall last in line when considering the tools that are available for your use or consideration. Even the simplest of them can awe your kind with how they can so easily solve your problems or confound your enemies. It is an unbelievably idiotic achievement to lay claim to. Even insects know better." "So you're saying that I have some skill or ability that might help resolve this issue in Vulcanheim County?" "Obviously. Lady Shiltier mentioned to Momon that you once possessed such an ability, until an episode of the aforementioned idiocy caused you to lose it." As caustic as her tone was, she could not refute her words. Ludmilla thought exactly as Nobe had described. Classes and the powers that were derived from them were considered special. They were exceptional qualities mostly set apart from mundane life and normal patterns of thought. After many weeks of neglecting to do so, she stretched out with her senses, checking for her long-lost ability. Its response was immediate. I didn't know, my lord. I'm no crook." A loose-jowled man with sweaty skin looked up at the dais with pleading eyes. Upon that dais, behind a well-worn oak table, sat Lord Torkel Vulcanheim and Lady Adelia Vulcanheim. Sanju stood behind a desk below and to the side. Several footmen attended the hall. "I swear to the gods, my lord." The man's plaintive voice echoed up and down the hall, "We're good and honest folk." From the shadows of the servants' entrance, Ludmilla and Nobe observed the proceedings. "What's this we?" Nobe sneered, "and only fools would defend themselves by claiming that they're good and honest." "An attempt to curry sympathy," Ludmilla murmured back as she looked on with interest. "It's not uncommon for people to speak like this." "This worm broke the law," Nobe muttered. "There's nothing left but to accept his deserved punishment. What point is there in having all of these gnats buzzing around the hall?" The gnats in question were the man's wife, several of his friends, the master of the Bakers' Guild and the senior priest of the local temple with two of his attendants. The man's wife wrung her hands tearfully. His friends all held worried expressions. The guildmaster had a grim look. The delegation from the temple frowned in unison, occasionally shaking their heads. "It's all an attempt to curry sympathy," Ludmilla replied softly. "The baker admitted to his crime under the effects of charm person. All they can do is try and soften the blow." Before dawn that day, she and Nobe went out to observe the citizens as they started their daily routines. Her newly rediscovered ability was as vague as she remembered it. There was no such thing as a person who was perfectly compliant with the order of the Sorcerer's Kingdom and the will of the Sorcerer King. All she could do was try and figure out what fell in the range of everyday life and what was far enough out of line that she could justifiably suspect them for problematic behaviors. As with her previous experiences employing the ability, an individual was never always uniformly the same. Small things nudged them back and forth in attitude and general outlook. As of yet, she had never encountered anything like a giant arrow pointing down at a person's head blaring criminal to her amongst the citizenry. Like the mercenaries fleeing Facet County, however, past actions lingered on the impressions that she felt. How recent these acts had to be for her to recognize them was unknown. In the town, however, there was no pressing need to chase anyone down. Once she identified them, her targets were easily tracked. The citizens she picked out went around unconcerned, unaware of the fact that they were quarry being stalked. Ludmilla's first target, the baker currently standing trial before Count Vulcanheim, did not stand out in any overt way relative to the other denizens of Croston. Nothing in how he carried himself, interacted with others or conducted his affairs suggested that he was a criminal or even a slightly suspicious person. If anything, his behavior was as normal could get. People got along with him, and he had no discernible issues as a functional member of society. After about an hour of observation, Ludmilla went from being a stalker to feeling like a crazy stalker. That nobby seemed ever ready to snipe the baker through his storefront with a lightning bolt just made things that much worse. In the end, Ludmilla decided to take the man out into the back alley and have him charmed. The result left Ludmilla somewhere between wanting her anticipation back and feeling bemused. With the man being about the worst of what Ludmilla had detected in the town, she wondered how a truly malicious actor would register to her senses. Nobby, however, appeared unreasonably furious with the baker, despite the nature of his infractions. Even in such a minor case, the web of social threads ensnared all parties with an interest in the matter. The wife worried over the future of their family. His friends were either genuinely worried for the man or wary over how their association might be perceived. The guildmaster had to consider the implications of one of his members being charged and what it meant to his organization. It was illegal for the temples to interfere with government functions, but there was a tiny space where they could appeal to one's better nature, pleading for an opportunity for reform rather than corporal punishment. As far as Ludmilla knew, the last was unique to places where the faith of the four held sway over the population. The faith of the six did not hold any belief in the inherent better nature of people, nor did mercy and sympathy hold any sway over justice. Humanity required guidance, and sometimes that guidance came in the form of actions exercised for the greater good. It did not mean that punishments were arbitrarily harsh, but no one thought to interfere in the delivery of a verdict and its associated penalties. Lord Vulcanheim was a follower of the Four, however, and his people were largely the same. As such, Ludmilla was curious how the proceedings would play out. The young nobleman was well known for his conscientious and compassionate nature, and this nature was something that many might try and take advantage of. Ridiculous, Nobby sniffed. Ludmilla's lips turned up in amusement. The situation was indeed ridiculous, an amalgamation of several disparate elements that culminated in the trial on display before them. Mr. Brioche, Lord Vulcanheim visibly struggled to maintain a straight face. You are over-dramatizing your case. What precisely do you think is going to happen to you? I don't know, my lord. I guess it was like poaching. Oh, gods, poachers are hung. Or. The baker's voice grew more desperate with every panicked breath. Please, my lord, mercy. Mercy on my poor soul. I didn't do nothing to deserve this. Don't send me off to be damned for eternity. Mournful voices rose from the court's audience as the man fell onto his knees and started to weep. Heated indignation coursed through Ludmilla. Lord Vulcanheim exchanged glances with his new wife, then turned his attention to the blubbering baker. Look, he said, all you have to do is provide restitution for what was stolen. I'm not a thief, my lord. I didn't steal no one's things. Whether you realized it or not, Lord Vulcanheim told him, the fact that you committed theft still stands. Besides, paying it all back shouldn't be such a dreadful matter these days, yes? As long as compensation is made according to an agreed-upon schedule, you will have nothing further to worry about. Really? Really? Mr. Brioche stood up again on unsteady legs, then turned to embrace his wife. Their sobs of relief filled the hall. Their friends shed tears as well. The delegation from the temple smiled in unison with satisfied nods. The guildmaster was the only one that did not appear to share in their reception of the outcome, probably because the case carried a precedent that he would need to address with all of his members. Lord Vulcanheim nodded to his footman, and they ushered the group out. Except for the delegation from the temple. The next defendant was escorted in with a similar following and a similar look of dread on his face. As Ludmilla and Nobbe continued with their observation, common threads appeared as the cases were each resolved. A combination of ignorance, illiteracy, common culture and unfamiliar practices that came with unfamiliar circumstances had inevitably given rise to a myriad of tiny inefficiencies in the way every defendant had carried out their responsibilities. From the administration's standpoint, the term for such inefficiencies was corruption. Petty corruption, but corruption nonetheless. It was nothing at all like the popular tales of evil nobles who abused their power in comical ways to gain stupendously unfair benefits. Instead, it was hundreds of citizens engaged in town industries who could not read, did not understand what was expected of them, and did not even realize what they were doing was wrong. Each was a tiny grain of sand in the vast mechanisms that drove the nation, and each affected the system by an equally tiny amount. Yet these grains of sand added up. There were 250,000 human citizens directly involved in the industries of the Sorceress Kingdom, and each had the potential to become one of those tiny grains of sand, be it intentional or not. Nearly all of the cases involved the months before the summer harvest when the administration was providing for the welfare of the citizens in the aftermath of the annexation. Food and supplies were distributed to population centers with the expectation that they would in turn be distributed in the manner mandated by the government. Barley, for instance, was distributed to flour mills. The flour from the mills would be sent to storehouses. Those storehouses would ration daily allotments to village families or bakeries in towns, as was with Mr. Brioche's case. Each transfer of goods was accompanied by an expectation of wastage from production processes and handling during transport. This figure was derived from existing numbers that incorporated these inefficiencies, effectively making the problem invisible when looking down from the top. Taking an unaccounted for portion for one's own family, giving a particularly hungry-looking child another roll of bread, using the ingredients supplied to bake goods not mandated by the administration for variety or at the request of others. This was the corruption seen in many of the cases, not born of malice or vile degrees of selfishness, but from ignorance and even charity. The government provided resources according to carefully calculated projections, but these resources were being used in an unintended manner by those responsible for distribution. It was an oversight by the central administration, which issued their directives under certain assumptions. These oversights should have been identified by local leaders who would, in turn, rectify the issues at their level and bring the problem to the attention of the House of Lords and the Royal Court. In theory, at any rate, it was not an issue that human nobles from any nation in the region could seriously consider pursuing without an army of administrative aides. In the Sorceress Kingdom, this army came in the form of the Elder Liches, but simply having them did not remedy what was a cultural blind spot. Like with the undead laborers, the reception of the Elder Liches was mixed. Clara and Ludmilla eagerly embraced the powerful new administrative capabilities that they represented. Others still balked at their use. If Nonna's correspondences with her peers were any indication, Count Vulcanheim was not the only noble that appeared to treat the directives issued by the administration as goals to achieve rather than the minimum acceptable standard. Shortly after midday, the procession of defendants ran dry and Lord Vulcanheim called a recess for lunch. Ludmilla and Nobbe came out from the servants' entrance, walking up to the Count who was slouching in his seat. "I hope that all had something to do with what you came here to investigate, Miss Camilla." "Most likely not, Lord Vulcanheim," Ludmilla replied. "It was something that I noticed, so I thought I would bring it to your attention. I'm not sure whether to thank you or resent you. Personally, I feel like some sort of evil magistrate now. I believe your handling of each case was even-handed. It's better to be thought of as fair rather than soft. Hun. I suppose that's the sign I've been wearing around my neck recently. So, how many hundreds more have you lined up in front of the town hall?" The rattle of several carts echoed out from the servants' entrance. Lunch was brought in by a line of maids, and Lord Vulcanheim bid Ludmilla and Nobbe be seated. Ludmilla eyed the meal as it was set out over the table. It was decidedly rural fare, featuring dishes prepared from wild game, fresh produce and brown bread. I think your awareness of these problems' existence is enough to get you started, my lord. Ludmilla picked up their discussion. Your guildmasters should be busy informing their members as well. I thought it convenient that I only ever saw each of them once, Lord Vulcanheim mused. You did this on purpose to mitigate all those theatrics, I assume? To help smooth things out in general, yes. We, as the audience, are aware of the situation each defendant is in. The theatrics of the people brought forward today, however, were rooted in genuine fears. Yes, well, I suppose I have to thank you for that. Provided that hundreds of people aren't fleeing the city right now. A furrow crossed Ludmilla's brow as she tried to imagine what Lord Vulcanheim described. I don't think the guildmasters would do that, she smirked. Probably not, he agreed. A part of me very much wants to flee, however. Now that everything's spilt out into the open, what will the royal court do? I can't speak for the royal court, but the central administration should be pleased with this development. Indeed, Sanju said from his desk. This? Lord Vulcanheim started coughing mid-swallow. He covered his mouth with a napkin while Lady Adelia leaned over to gently stroke his back. Damn it, Sanju. The Count croaked, where the hell did you come from? I never left. At any rate, the cases so far, if extrapolated to the entire population, represent anywhere from a 3 to 6% improvement in economic efficiency. It will, as you say, please the central administration. The elder lich returned to its work. Despite its dispassionate tone, that it chose to interject at all showed just how excited it was. Lord Vulcanheim cast a somewhat suspicious look in Ludmilla's direction. You seem to get along famously with the undead. Ludmilla had to make an active effort not to bristle at his comment. How do you mean, my lord? She asked. Things just feel smoother, he answered. Tell me, did you have this sort of problem in your own domain? Like those represented by the cases this morning? The problems in my domain were of an entirely different nature, Ludmilla replied. The elder liches were already performing regular audits of government-related activities by the time I had enough tenants for this to start becoming a problem. They're even being invited to help with the private business of some of my subjects, now. Lord Vulcanheim raised an eyebrow as he worked on a mouthful of the main course. He washed it down with a sip of wine. Really, he said. Frontier folk sure are made differently. More differently than you know. The corner of Ludmilla's lip tightened at his light tone. How many generations would it take for Wardensvale to raise new lines of hardy frontier folk? Was it even possible now, given the state of the sorceress kingdom? The vast majority of them are migrants from the interior, my lord, Ludmilla replied. Which brings me to something else I wanted to ask you about.